Във втория панел ще се придвижим в настоящето. Чухме много интересни истории до тук, но от тук нататък ще търсим общите проблеми пред уязвимите групи и общите механизми, да работим заедно за по-добро разпознаване и спазване на правата на уязвимите групи. Първият лектор в този панел е Marzena Zukowska, човек с впечатляваща биография на комуникатор и застъпник. Marzena е съпредседател на Radical Communicators Network, международна общност за комуникатори за социална справедливост. Също така е комуникационен стратег и съосновател на полската организация на мигрантите за промяна POMOC. В продължение на десетилетие е разработвала наративни и организационни стратегии за водещи социални и политически движения в Съединените щати, Великобритания и Европа. Marzena, welcome! Да видим къде е.
Hi, sorry, my Bulgarian is still not at the best level. Hi everyone, I'm Marzena Zukowska and I'm the co-founder of Polish Migrants Organise for Change, or POMOC. We work with Polish and Eastern European migrant women and gender non-conforming people who live in London and the UK, and we kind of bring people together to organize for our rights, dignity and justice in the UK. Forgive me, I'm going to use my notes, but my reasoning is that 2 years through a pandemic and my memory is not as good as it used to be. So yes. So in this presentation, I'm going to touch on a lot of different topics, hopefully some interesting case studies that could be useful for your human rights and organizing work as well. So a year ago in London, I had the opportunity to be part of a really amazing photo shoot called Stop the Bullshit, What It's Like to Be Young, Polish, and LGBTQ+. And this in particular was really important to me because growing up as a young Polish and queer immigrant in Chicago, I often felt that my identity was in a state of flux. Sometimes I was too queer, but also not queer enough. I was too immigrant, not immigrant enough. Too Eastern European, too American, too working class, always in between. And then being part of this project was really, really emotional because it reminded me that kind of our dominant realities that we exist in often force us to erase and shrink those really beautiful intersections of what it's like to be between identities, right? To fit certain types of boxes and binaries. To forget our histories and really where we've come from, and to make us believe that there's only one path forward, right? One way to kind of elevate the individual over the collective, to settle for reform rather than revolution, and to believe that we are alone. For me, activism has really been the antidote, activism really from the grassroots up, and a daily reminder of how much power we have in the face of homophobic, racist, and fascist governments that many of us are up against. And so that's really what this presentation is about, is how to shatter this myth of monolithic identities, right? And embrace our intersections, and how that can unlock opportunities to have this kind of global, actionable solidarity and really stronger social movements. So how do we do that? That's a really, really big question. And I think in order to answer it, I think we need to step back and look at the context, right? So where are we and how did we get here? I'd like to focus on Poland specifically because I think my home country can share a bit of a global story and shed insight on what's happening globally. So in order to understand what's happening in Poland right now, we have to at least go back to 2015. This is the year the Law and Justice Party, or PiS, came to power. Right, this right-wing party swept in on the heels of the 2015 European refugee crisis, right? And their promise to the country, a Poland just for Poles, one that is free of refugees from the Middle East and North Africa and Western gender politics. I'm sure many of you have heard that before here. Both, they argued, threatened our Catholic values, right? Our traditional Catholic values, as well as our national sovereignty. Their victory, right, the Law and Justice Party's victory, has led to now 7 years of undermining the independence of the judiciary, attacking freedom of the press, attempting to outlaw sex education, and restricting abortion, something they succeeded in doing just last year. But it wasn't until the 2019 parliamentary elections that the rainbow disease, right, the LGBTQ boogeyman, appeared on the national stage in Poland. Similarly to the xenophobic rhetoric that we heard in 2015, LGBTQ people were constructed as an ideology, right? Something that was threatening our way of life. That summer, pride parades all over the country, including in my hometown of Białystok on the border with Belarus, were overrun by far-right mobilizations. And again, peace positioned itself as the defender of traditional family values, right? And with support of the Catholic Church and state-run media, they swept into victory again, and they won a bigger margin in 2019 than they won in 2015. Since then, over 100 local authorities in Poland have declared themselves quote-unquote LGBT-free zones, right? This photo shows one parody sign created by a Polish activist to mock some of these towns that were passing these measures. Right, we've also seen a rise in hate crimes, even though Poland doesn't actually acknowledge a hate crime on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. And we've seen the number of people, LGBTQ plus people with depression, rise. And right now we have a citizens initiative called Stop LGBT that it's making its way through Parliament. If it becomes law, it's going to effectively ban any sort of pride parades and queer activism in the country. Notably, it was created by a conservative campaigner called Kaja Godek, who kind of notoriously created very similar citizens' initiatives to try and ban abortion, right? So all of these issues are very much connected. But I think if we just look at what's happening in Poland, we're going to miss the big picture, right? And the big picture to me is that the rise in homophobia, attacks on women's rights, and anti-immigrant sentiment is not unique to Poland. In fact, I think what's happening in Poland is happening everywhere. And it's dangerous for us to pathologize Poland or Eastern Europe specifically as being exceptionally or uniquely homophobic or racist or fascist, right? Because it lets Western governments off the hook and underestimates the global power of a lot of these ideologies, right? So we've got Boris Johnson and Priti Patel right now in the UK trying to ban the right to protest, give police more powers, and pass anti-immigrant legislation. We've got Viktor Orban in Hungary, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? We've got Narendra Modi in India, we've got Vladimir Putin in Russia, and we just had Donald Trump in the US, right? We have seen these so-called democratic governments and far-right politicians pass laws, enact unconstitutional measures, and spread divisive narratives in the service of fascism, right? And one of the basic tenets of fascism is control of our bodies, right? Of queer and trans bodies, of women's bodies, of immigrant bodies. And it is supported by divide and conquer narratives that pit our communities against each other, right? It makes us fear and resent our neighbors who might not look like us. It isolates us in our power. It makes us believe that there's not enough space in our social movements for all of our issues. Because if we're talking about immigrant rights, then feminism's just gonna have to wait. So how do we fight back? I'd like to now share a couple of examples and insights from some of my work in the UK and Poland and the US, as well as other activists. And as I said, you know, take what's useful and leave what might not be. So my first big insight, I think, from my work is to show solidarity, no matter how big or how small. Right, because that's what I believe our strength really comes from. For me, one of the most inspiring things to witness over the last few years has been Marta Lempart, who's an outspoken, sometimes very vulgar lesbian woman at the helm of the Polish women's strike. In October 2020, she had the audacity to tell the Polish government, wypierdalać, which means fuck off, when they tried to ban abortion once again in the time of a global pandemic. And there are so many LGBTQ plus activists, just like Marta, who have been at the forefront of the iconic black umbrella-wielding black protests, right, that since 2016 have mobilized the biggest social movement that Poland has seen since the fall of communism. And I think the really, really important thing is that they've managed to mobilize people from small cities and big towns all over. And rainbow flags have flown at these abortion rights protests. And then groups like Aborcyjny Dream Team have vocalized that it's not only cisgender and straight women who get abortions, right? And these types of intersections have been so important to highlight because our issues and identities don't exist in isolation. We need to communicate and show our solidarity actively, right? If we're fighting for the rights of queer and trans folks, then we must also reject border regimes and stand up for migrant communities. If we are willing to protest in front of the Polish embassy for sexual and reproductive freedoms, then we must also be ready to say Black Lives Matter. 2 is that we must invest in community leaders in order to mobilize our communities. So at my organization, POMOC, we believe that investing in grassroots leaders who have lived experience in the issues we work on is key. Right? And we believe in compensating them for their labor rather than just treating them as unpaid volunteers, which is what tends to happen in the entire NGO sector. So for example, in 2021, we ran a campaign called She Votes, which was focused on getting Polish women registered to vote in local elections in England. We found bilingual leaders in 3 cities across the UK, London, Liverpool, and Manchester, and each of them brought something different to the campaign. So in Manchester, we had a local artist who tried to mobilize creatives, and she had access to all of the local warehouses. In Liverpool, we had a young student who went from organizing one small feminist protest to becoming the president of her Polish Student Society. And then in London, we had a mom of 3, like very working class, who had access and the know-how of all of the Eastern European shops and knew exactly which places we needed to target to get people registered to vote, right? They worked hours that made sense for them and their schedules and their communities, and they had the space and independence to come up with their own ideas, but we gave them the support to realize those ideas. And this model was so successful for us that it's basically become the basis of all of our work at POMOC, right? So we now have leaders and hubs in various cities in the UK, right? People who are creating political drag workshops, reading groups, hosting vigils and mutual aid networks in support of Ukraine, and so much more. Number 3, I think we must use every single tool at our disposal. I don't believe there's any one right way to make the world a more just and equitable place. In fact, we should use every tool we have, right? Organizing a massive protest in front of a detention center in the UK is just as valuable as getting, your neighborhood together to try to vote out a corrupt politician, right? In the UK, though, we've definitely found local elections to be one of the most critical and at-scale opportunities to organize specifically migrants. From our own work, I could say that the political situation in Great Britain has really accentuated feelings of powerlessness among Eastern Europeans. I think we saw this in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, and now the UK government is just continuing to pass more anti-immigrant policies. And so millions of people in the UK feel like they don't have any kind of influence over decisions that impact their lives, right? And increased fears that their rights are just not going to be protected in the UK. I think given the UK government's track record, sluggishness, for example, in helping refugees, current sluggishness in helping Ukrainian refugees, I'd say those fears are quite accurate. Local elections, however, are a space where a lot of European citizens can vote and can create change on issues that impact their day-to-day lives, right? It could be something basic like recycling. People in the UK feel so passionate about rubbish bins for whatever reason, like where they're positioned. And so we found that to be a good way to kind of activate people politically as a first start, right? I think with local politics in particular, they might not necessarily change national immigration policy, but they can help change the way Ukrainians or Afghans or Syrian refugees are actually welcomed in British communities, right? That's something that we have control over. I know that democracy goes so much deeper than voting, but elections are one way to help our voices be heard and reflected in public discourse. And it's a way to build power and engagement at every single level of decision-making, especially among communities that often feel ignored and excluded from the process. I think third is meet your communities where they're at. Working from the UK and the US, I often heard this myth about immigrants, that they're hard to reach, they're too difficult or costly to engage, not worth the effort, right? I heard this from political parties, I've heard this from NGOs. The problem with these phrases is that they could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? We hear over and over from migrants that political parties simply don't engage with them and that they don't feel reflected in the political process despite having the right to vote. Or even worse, political parties will wait, I'm sure this happens in Bulgaria, a couple of months before the elections, and then they kind of descend on neighborhoods being like, can we please have your vote? But people can see that they're being pandered to, right? That these are politicians that are not actually, they don't actually care about them, right? As organizers, right, we don't wait until communities come to us. We go out into the communities, right? That's the point of organizing. We meet them where they're already at, right? It could be an Eastern European shop. It could be a hair salon. It could be a community center. It could be on TikTok or Facebook. We ask what motivates people, what needs they have, how they feel about democracy and politics. We invest in translation and culturally competent materials so communities actually feel welcome. In 2021, we had materials translated into Polish, Bulgarian, Lithuanian, Latvian, and Romanian. So we made sure that people can really understand what the political process and what local elections look like, right? And people are on this political journey with us. We designed campaigns together, and it makes a huge difference when people feel like they're co-creating something, right? I think this is especially important for Eastern Europeans, because in the West, our communities are often studied, they're scrutinized, they're victimized, they're racialized, and they're scapegoated. But rarely is our lived experience seen as a source of creativity and expertise and a source of solutions, right? 5, we need to prioritize community care. At POMOC, obviously, we don't shy away from politics, but we know that not everyone is there. For many people, politics is associated with something negative, right? Parties and candidates they don't trust, systems that don't represent them, language they don't understand, or honestly, something that requires privilege and luxury and mental space to be able to engage with, right? I recognize that if someone's struggling with housing or food insecurity or issues in their workplace, right, we need to help them through those issues first. That is why we run active referral networks in Polish, Romanian, and Romanes, and have trusted organizations to send people to. We walk people every step of the way through the process so that they get the tools to help themselves and can take those back to their communities and neighborhoods. For us, that is the opening of a conversation and a way to then say, this is a problem you're having individually, but it's systemic, right? This is something we need to address on a bigger level. And I think direct service can be one of the most radical forms of social change, right? The Black Panther Party did this in the US with their free school breakfast programs. The Polish women's strike did this during the COVID-19 pandemic, where they were helping people legally try to figure out how they can get compensation from the government for losing their jobs. We must build on these radical legacies and try to connect direct service to political empowerment. And finally, we need to flip the script and change the story. So I believe stories are the backbone of social movements, right? They define whose lives are valued and whose are not, and they really form the rules of what's acceptable in society, right? Stories of hardworking immigrants have normalized exploitation and made clear that only those people who are able-bodied and self-sacrificing are deserving of rights and protections, and also not always. Stories of Muslims and Black people as a threat, as terrorists, have made state-level surveillance in Europe and the US something that makes people feel quote-unquote safe. And stories of LGBTQ+ people in Poland being referred to as an ideology makes us seem perverse, threatening, less than human. It's this last one I'd really like to linger on. Because at the beginning, I mentioned that there are all these LGBTQ-free zones, right, that are being set up in different places across Poland. They're really, really upsetting and awful, but they're not legally binding, right? So they're not criminalizing LGBTQ+ identity. But I think their purpose is a lot more insidious, right? It's something that is trying to shape the narrative, right? Because what does it mean to name a certain group of people and ideology, right? It's dehumanizing. And it also furthers a very dangerous and false narrative that Polish identity is inherently Catholic, white, cisgendered, and heterosexual. And it effectively creates this hostile environment of social control that if you don't fall within those categories, right, those very tightly constructed categories, right, that you are not representative of Polish society, right? So who are we talking about? We're talking about refugees who have been and continue to be stuck at the Polish-Belarusian border, those from Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Cameroon, but so many other places. People who need or want abortions but can't afford to get them outside of the country. Politicians' daughters and wives can get them outside of the country. Queer and trans people, Black and brown and Afro-Polish people, Muslims, Jews, and Roma communities, and even hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have been forced to live undocumented for so many years, working in not the greatest conditions in Poland, subjected to discrimination. This isn't to undermine the incredible effort of the Polish society to now welcome hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees, but it's to point out the hypocrisy of the government, which over the last year voted to build a 350 million euro border wall between itself and Belarus, right? That sounds familiar. That sounds very, very Donald Trump. So this story is something we must reject not just for Poland, but for Eastern Europe, right? That there's no one way to be Polish or Eastern European, and that our power is in how vibrantly diverse our community is, right? That's the strength, that is the solidarity. So just to finish, and I'm happy to share this after, but I just wanted to give a shout out to some of the really amazing kind of cross-border fluid organizations that are working in the UK and Poland and really between borders. Black is Polish started shortly after the 2020 Black Lives Matter uprisings, kind of bringing the conversation of racism and anti-Blackness to the forefront of dialogue in Poland. Solidarity Knows No Borders is a UK-wide network. So they're really fighting to connect the immigrant rights movement, and it was started by Zrinka Bralo, who's a Bosnian refugee. Make Poland Queer Again, also founded by both Polish activists in Poland and those in the diaspora. The cool thing about Make Poland Queer Again is that they try to funnel resources and funding, which is really hard to get in Poland, so that Pride Praise could actually keep going on. Grupa Granica, which has been organizing since the Polish-Belarusian border crisis last year and has been continuing to do that work even if it's not visible, and they're always looking for support. And then Red Pepper Magazine, which is a leftist magazine in the UK, and they sorely need more Eastern European, Bulgarian stories, so please, I recommend pitching to them. And then the last thing, as an Eastern European, I just wanted to say solidarity with the people of Ukraine, but then also all of those people who are currently fleeing wars and conflict. We know that people who are already on the margins of society, for example, LGBTQ plus people, those marginalizations are often exacerbated in the times of war and conflict. So just solidarity, and all migrants, refugees, asylum seekers should be welcome. We should open the borders. So thank you.